The notice board stood at the center of the garrison courtyard, crowded with parchment and authority. Orders, rotations, warnings, words that shaped the day whether you understood them or not. The Orc Warrior stood before it longer than anyone else, her broad shoulders squared, her face carved into the practiced neutrality of someone pretending to read. She recognized symbols, numbers, the shape of urgency, but meaning slipped through the cracks like water through clenched fingers. Other warriors glanced at the board, scoffed, laughed, moved on. She stayed. Too long. Long enough for the familiar heat of shame to crawl up her spine. Orcs were not supposed to hesitate. Orcs obeyed. They did not ask questions, and they certainly did not admit ignorance. Illiteracy among warriors was not unusual. It was expected. Reading was for tacticians, scribes, humans. Strength was for orcs. A captain barked an order nearby. She flinched almost imperceptibly and stepped back, pretending she had seen what she needed. She had not. The punishment came later, delivered quietly and efficiently. Wrong place. Wrong time. She accepted it without protest, jaw tight, eyes forward. Pain was simple. Confusion was not. It was the human scholar who noticed. He had been passing through the garrison with a satchel of copied texts, eyes half lost in thought, mind wandering somewhere safer than the city's noise. He slowed when he saw her return to the board after most had left, scanning the parchment again with careful intensity. Not casual, not idle, intent. He recognized the signs because he had worn them himself once, back when he was young, before learning how to hide uncertainty behind confidence and language. "You don't have to stand so close," he said gently, not looking at her, as if speaking to the air. "The ink won't bite." She stiffened instantly, hand drifting toward her weapon before she caught herself. Orc instinct. Defense first. Shame second. "I can read," she said flatly. "I didn't say you couldn't." Silence followed. Thick. Dangerous. The scholar turned then, meeting her gaze without challenge. He was unimpressive by any martial standard. Thin, stooped slightly, fingers ink-stained instead of scarred. But his eyes were steady, observant, kind in a way that did not ask for permission. "The handwriting's poor," he added. "Even people who read well struggle with that script." Her eyes flicked back to the board despite herself. The lie he offered was small, thoughtful, a way out. She took it. "I missed a change," she said. "Not a confession. A statement." "Yes," he replied. "I thought so." She waited for mockery, for superiority, for a lecture about how warriors should know their place. It did not come. "If you want," the scholar said, lowering his voice. "I could explain it. Just this one." "Why?" she asked. He shrugged. "Because it's already written. There's no reason it should stay inaccessible." That word caught her. Inaccessible. Not forbidden. Not above you. Just closed. He pointed. "That symbol marks reassignment. That line names the unit. You were sent east, not south." Her chest tightened. That explained everything. She nodded once. Orc thanks were not effusive. They were measured. The scholar turned to leave. "Wait," she said, the word surprising them both. He paused. "You said you could explain," she said carefully. "Could you do that again?" He studied her then. Not her strength, not her scars, but the choice she was making. To ask. To risk. "Yes," he said. "If you'd like." "When?" He smiled faintly. "Whenever you're free. Knowledge keeps odd hours." She watched him walk away, something unfamiliar settling in her chest. Not gratitude. Not yet. Something heavier. That night, she stared at her orders by torchlight, tracing symbols she had memorized without understanding. For the first time, the letters felt less like barriers and more like doors. She did not yet know what learning to read would cost her, or what she would one day choose to protect because of it. They did not meet where lessons were supposed to happen. The scholar chose a narrow archive corridor behind the city records hall, a place forgotten by clerks and ignored by guards because it held nothing new or valuable. Old ledgers lined the walls, their spines cracked, titles faded into irrelevance. Knowledge abandoned by time had a way of becoming safe. She arrived early, armor exchanged for plain leather, weapon left behind after a long moment of hesitation. Orc warriors did not disarm lightly. Doing so felt like shedding a layer of skin. Still, she complied. This was not training. This was something more dangerous. The scholar arrived with no books at first, only a piece of charcoal and a scrap of parchment. "Before words," he said, settling cross-legged on the floor without ceremony. There are shapes. She frowned. I know shapes. I know, he replied. But these ones have agreed meanings. That's the difference. He drew a single letter. Clean. Simple. This sound, he said. It appears everywhere. At the beginning of commands. At the end of warnings. She leaned closer despite herself. Orcs were taught to memorize symbols as units, recognize the look of danger, not its language. Breaking words into parts felt like taking a blade apart to understand how it cut. She repeated the sound softly. It felt awkward in her mouth, like learning a new stance. Good, he said, not praising, just acknowledging. Again, they worked slowly, painfully. He did not rush, did not correct her sharply when she stumbled. When frustration tightened her shoulders, he paused without comment and let the silence do its work. Orcs understood endurance. He let that strength serve her instead of fighting it. These marks, she said at one point, tapping the parchment, they control people. They describe, he replied. People decide what to do with them. That's not what I've seen. No, he agreed. That's why learning them matters. She absorbed that in silence. Days passed, then weeks. They met in margins, between patrols, after drills, during hours no one bothered to claim. He brought old notices, discarded contracts, mundane texts that taught function before beauty. She learned to sound words out slowly, jaw tightening when she failed, breath steadying when she succeeded. He never laughed. She never forgot. Once, a guard passed too close and she froze, instinct screaming exposure. The scholar simply slid the parchment beneath a ledger and continued speaking of weather patterns until the footsteps faded. He understood risk. He respected it. You could get in trouble, she said later. So could you, he replied. Yet here we are. She watched his hands as he wrote. Careful, precise, shaped by years of patience rather than force. It struck her then how differently power could look. His strength was quiet, portable. It fit in margins. What do humans gain from this? She asked one evening. He considered. Clarity, he said finally. Sometimes justice. Occasionally survival. And you? She pressed. He met her gaze. The same. That night, she read her first sentence alone. It was a supply list. Unremarkable. Ordinary. She felt like she had lifted a stone she hadn't known was pressing on her chest. For the first time, orders were not just received. They were understood. And understanding, she was beginning to realize, was a form of strength no one could easily take from her. The first time she questioned an order, she did it silently. The parchment lay on the table between them, a routine deployment notice marked with seals and signatures meant to discourage scrutiny. She read it slowly, sounding the words out in her head the way the scholar had taught her. When meaning finally assembled itself, her brow furrowed. This route, she said carefully, tapping the line with one blunt finger. It cuts through civilian quarters. Yes, the scholar replied. It wasn't always like that. They expect resistance, she continued. The wording allows for discretion, which means force, he said. She sat back, a low unease coiling in her stomach. Orc warriors were trained to execute, not interpret. The order would be obeyed because obedience was simpler than understanding. But now understanding had arrived, uninvited and irreversible. I was told this was a standard sweep, she said. It is, the scholar replied. From a certain point of view. Silence stretched. The weight of choice settled heavily between them. Is this why they don't teach us? She asked finally. He nodded once. Knowledge complicates power. The words echoed in her mind long after she left. That night, she stood in formation as the captain barked instructions, her body moving automatically while her thoughts raced ahead, tracing consequences she had never been meant to see. When the order came to advance, she did so with the same precision as always, but something had changed. She moved carefully. She redirected her unit where she could, slowed the pace, chose restraint when force was permitted. The mission ended without incident, but the absence of destruction felt like a rebellion all its own. Rumors followed. Whispers of an orc who hesitated, of a warrior who read too much, of a human scholar who meddled. She confronted him the next day, anger and fear tangled tight in her chest. You didn't warn me, she said. You didn't tell me this would happen. He met her gaze steadily. Would you have chosen ignorance if I had? She opened her mouth, then closed it. The truth sat heavy and undeniable. No, she admitted. Then I did warn you, he said gently. You just hadn't reached the part where the cost becomes visible. They did not meet for several days after that. She needed distance, space to decide whether learning was worth the fracture spreading through her life. But even as she considered stopping, she found herself reading everything she could. Old notices, scratched warnings on walls, half-forgotten inscriptions on city stones. The city began to notice. Merchants complained when she questioned contracts. Guards grew uneasy when she paused before carrying out orders, eyes flicking to the fine print. Knowledge had given her something more dangerous than doubt. It had given her choice. When she returned to the archive corridor, she did not sit. "Continue," she said. The scholar searched her face. "You understand what this means?" "Yes. It will not make your life easier." "I know." He nodded and drew the next letter. The price of learning was no longer abstract. It was being paid. In reputation, in obedience, in the quiet distance growing between her and the role she had been trained to fill. But as she traced the lines of the new word, she understood something else as well. Once you learn to read the world, you can never go back to following it blindly. They never spoke about loyalty, and that was precisely how it formed. Not through vows or promises or the formal language both their cultures respected, but through repetition, through the quiet certainty that when one of them arrived, the other would be there. The scholar never asked her to come. She never announced herself. Lessons happened when they happened, folded into evenings and stolen hours like contraband hope. He taught without urgency, and she learned with a patience that surprised even her. Orc warriors were trained for speed, for decisive action. Reading forced her to slow down, to sit with uncertainty until it yielded meaning. That discipline, she discovered, was harder than any drill. The scholar noticed changes before she did. The way she no longer scanned rooms constantly when she entered. The way her questions grew sharper, less about letters and more about intent. She asked why words were arranged the way they were, why certain laws repeated themselves across generations, why records disappeared in years marked by unrest. He answered when he could, admitted ignorance when he couldn't. He never pretended authority. That mattered. One evening, rain drummed against the archive windows, muting the city into something softer. He handed her a thin booklet, an old census record, mundane and brittle. "Read this," he said, not as instruction but invitation. She did, slowly, carefully. When she finished, she looked up. "They counted us," she said, "but didn't name us." He nodded. Numbers are easier to control than names. She absorbed that quietly. Orcs were counted in bodies and blades, never in stories. "You could stop," she said suddenly. "Teaching me." "Yes," he agreed. "You don't." "No." "Why?" He considered the question longer this time. "Because knowledge shouldn't be hoarded like a weapon," he said at last. "And because you take it seriously." That answer settled something in her chest. Respect, freely given, without dominance. Orc culture understood hierarchy. This was something else, recognition without command. The bond deepened not through closeness, but through restraint. He never touched her armor, never corrected her posture, never raised his voice. She, in turn, never used her strength to intimidate, never demanded answers he wasn't ready to give. They met as they were, not as the city expected them to be. Rumors began to stir. A clerk noticed missing documents returned neatly. A guard complained that orders were being questioned, politely, correctly, inconveniently. Someone saw an orc reading a posted notice and laughing, quietly, to herself. Laughter unsettled people more than anger. "People are watching," she said one night. "They always are," he replied. "They just don't like what they're seeing now." She studied him then. "If this costs you your position." "I was never secure," he interrupted gently. "I was just tolerated." That honesty bound her tighter than any oath could have. Orc loyalty did not form around comfort. It formed around truth. The next time soldiers marched past the archive, she stood between them and the door without realizing she had moved. Not threatening, not defiant, just present. The scholar looked up, startled, and she met his gaze without explanation. Something had shifted. She was no longer just learning to read words. She was learning what they could protect. And the scholar, who had never asked for a guardian, never imagined one, began to understand that teaching her had created something far stronger than gratitude. It had created choice, and she was already choosing where she stood. Nothing formal marked the moment their connection became something more than lessons. There was no oath, no spoken promise, No ritual either of their peoples would have recognized as binding. It happened the way habits do, quietly, through repetition. He left a lamp burning in the archive corridor at dusk. She arrived without being summoned. He laid out parchment and charcoal. She sat. That was all. And yet, each evening that passed without question or hesitation tightened a thread neither of them had consciously tied. The scholar began to notice how she listened. Not with impatience, not with the blunt hunger for immediate utility that commanders favored, but with attention sharpened by respect. When she stumbled over a word, she did not curse or force it. She paused, breathed, tried again. Orc training taught endurance through pain. Reading demanded endurance through uncertainty. Watching her learn was like watching someone discover a new muscle, one that hurt at first, then slowly learned to carry weight. She, in turn, noticed how he taught. He never stood over her, never corrected her mid-sentence. When she misread something dangerous, a clause that could justify force, a line that erased responsibility, he waited until she finished, then asked what she thought it meant. If she was wrong, he guided her back without humiliation. Knowledge offered without dominance felt strange, disarming. It made her want to protect it. "You could teach others," she said one night, after reading a city ordinance aloud without stopping. "Humans." He smiled faintly. "They already think they know how to read." That answer stayed with her. Orcs respected expertise. Humans, she was learning, respected authority. The two were not the same. Outside the archive, the city continued its measured breathing. Inside, something delicate took shape. He began leaving marginal notes in the texts he brought, questions rather than explanations. She began answering them, slowly at first, then with growing confidence. Their lessons became conversations, and the conversations became a shared vigilance. When he looked troubled by a passage, she noticed. When she went silent over a word that cut too close to home, he waited. Rumors began as they always did, small and sticky. An orc seen reading a posted notice without help. A scholar whose copies returned annotated in a hand that was not his. Someone joked that the warrior had gone soft. Someone else said the scholar had gone mad. Neither of them responded. Attention fed rumor, silence starved it. One evening, voices echoed too close to the corridor. She rose instantly, body angling toward the doorway, the instinct to shield flaring without thought. The scholar caught the movement and stilled, startled. The footsteps passed. The danger receded. She remained standing a moment longer than necessary, then sat again as if nothing had happened. "You don't have to do that," he said quietly. She met his eyes. "I know." It was the first time she acknowledged the choice. From that night on, she walked him partway home after lessons, never too close, never ostentatious. When guards lingered, she lingered too. When a clerk questioned his access to a sealed shelf, she stood at his shoulder and waited. She did not threaten. She did not speak. Presence was enough. He understood then what he had given her, and what she had taken upon herself. In orc culture, a gift of power demanded guardianship. He had offered letters and meaning without condition. She had accepted them as something sacred. They never named it. Naming would have made it visible, and visibility invited interference. Instead, they let the bond remain what it was: unceremonious, unclaimed by law, strengthened by quiet repetition. And somewhere in the city's unnoticed margins, a human scholar and an orc warrior learned the same lesson from opposite sides. That trust, once formed, does not need witnesses to be real. The city did not react to change immediately. It rarely did. First came unease, the subtle tightening of routines, the extra glances, the way people began to double-check what they had once taken for granted. Merchants noticed when contracts were returned and signed, with questions written neatly in the margins. Guards noticed when an orc warrior paused before enforcing an order, eyes moving across the text instead of relying on shouted commands. Clerks noticed when ledgers that had been ignored for years suddenly mattered again. Unease turned into concern. Concern found a voice in whispers. She reads. Who taught her? Why does she ask questions? Knowledge, when confined to expected hands, felt safe. When it moved, it felt like theft. The scholar felt it first in the archive. Requests for certain records were delayed. Shelves he had always been allowed to access were suddenly restricted. A junior clerk asked, too casually, why an orc had been seen leaving the records hall at night. He answered with practiced politeness. but his stomach tightened. This was how scrutiny began, not with accusations, but with curiosity sharpened into suspicion. The warrior felt it in the garrison. Jokes stopped being jokes. Orders were repeated slowly, loudly, as if daring her to misunderstand. Once, a captain snatched a notice from her hands and demanded to know what she thought she was doing. She answered truthfully, reading. The laughter that followed was brittle, edged with something like fear. That night, she arrived late to the corridor. He saw it in the way she held herself, alert, coiled, already preparing for escalation. They're watching, she said. Yes, he replied. They always were. They just didn't think you could see them. She frowned at that. Seeing changes things. It always does. They worked anyway. He showed her how to read old trade laws, how to trace amendments layered over decades like scars. She learned how meaning could be buried under repetition, how injustice could be hidden inside procedure. Every lesson sharpened her understanding and the city's discomfort. When soldiers began lingering near the archive doors, she adjusted her route. When a merchant raised his voice, she stood silently beside the scholar, letting her presence speak without confrontation. Strength restrained unnerved people more than violence ever had. You're becoming a problem, someone told him in the market one afternoon. Orcs aren't meant to think this way, he answered without looking up from his basket. No one is meant to be ignorant. That remark followed him home like a shadow. The first official warning arrived in the form of a sealed letter, polite, vague, heavy with implication. It advised discretion. It suggested that certain educational efforts might be misunderstood. It reminded him of his position. He showed it to her that evening. They want you to stop, she said. Yes. Will you? He met her gaze. No. She nodded once. In orc culture, that nod would have been the beginning of a vow. From that point on, she did not merely accompany him. She positioned herself. At doors. In corridors. On streets where voices grew too confident. She did not threaten. She did not posture. She simply remained, an immovable fact in a city that preferred its problems abstract. The city began to worry not because an orc could read, but because she had learned what to read, and she had chosen to stand beside the one who taught her. She explained it to him on a night when the city felt too close, when voices carried through the windows and the lamps outside burned longer than usual. They sat at the small table in his rooms, parchment spread between them, the lesson abandoned halfway through a sentence neither of them could focus on. He had noticed the change in her posture these past days, the way she positioned herself between him and the door without thinking, the way her eyes tracked movement that had nothing to do with reading. It was not aggression. It was assessment. In my culture, she said slowly, choosing her words with the same care she now used for letters, a gift is never light. He looked up from the page. I didn't think of teaching as a gift. That's because humans think gifts end when they are given, she replied. For us, that is when they begin. She told him then what orcs did with gifts of power. Strength, weapons, shelter, mercy, anything that altered a person's ability to survive or choose. Such gifts created obligation, not as debt, but as alignment. You protected what had made you more than you were. You stood between it and the world that would try to take it back. You gave me words, she said. Words are not small. He felt a chill at that. I never asked for protection. I know, she said. That is why it is binding. The room seemed to shrink around them. He thought of the guards lingering near the archive, of the sealed letter, of the way certain names had begun to circulate in tones meant to sound casual. He had assumed her presence was kindness returned. He was beginning to understand it was something heavier. They will come for what I've found, he said quietly, thinking of the records he had been copying, the discrepancies that no one wanted named. For the books, for the questions. She nodded. And for you. He set the charcoal down, hands suddenly unsteady. I don't want you hurt because of me. She met his eyes, unflinching. I was hurt long before you. What you gave me changed the shape of that hurt. It gave it direction. Outside, a shout echoed, then laughter. Normal city sounds. Harmless, until they weren't. I chose this, she continued. Not because you taught me. Because you did not control what you taught. That matters. He realized then that the city's mistake was already made. They saw an orc warrior as a blunt instrument, a threat that could be managed with fear or force. They did not see a guardian forming, quiet, deliberate, informed. What does protection look like to you? He asked. She considered. standing where I am not expected, refusing to move when silence would be easier, making harm expensive. That sounds like war. No, she said. It sounds like deterrence. The word settled. Accurate. Precise. She had learned it from him. From that night on, the shape of their days changed. She began accompanying him openly, not hiding in corridors or margins. When he visited the records hall, she stood where everyone could see her. When a clerk questioned a request too sharply, she waited without speaking, eyes steady, presence undeniable. When guards arrived to inspect, she read the posted authority aloud, calmly, correctly, until inspection turned into embarrassment. The city did not know how to respond to an orc who protected paper. That was what shocked them first. The second shock came when she refused payment, refused praise, refused to be named a hero. I am only doing what is required, she said when pressed. What is required? Someone asked. She answered simply, guarding what was given freely. The scholar watched all of this with a mixture of awe and unease. He had believed knowledge was fragile, something that needed hiding to survive. She was showing him another truth. That knowledge, once shared, could be defended without being hoarded. He understood now what he had started. Not a rebellion, not a movement, but a line, drawn quietly, deliberately, behind which an orc warrior had decided something mattered enough to stand. And the city, sensing that decision, began to prepare for a confrontation it did not yet understand how to win. The first attempt to silence him came wrapped in courtesy. An invitation to present his findings to a small council, framed as interest and concern, delivered by a clerk whose smile never reached his eyes. The scholar read the letter twice, then a third time aloud, careful and precise. The words were generous. The intent was not. It asked for originals, not copies. It asked for discretion, not truth. It asked him to come alone. He folded the parchment slowly, the room quiet but for the sound of his breath, and understood that knowledge had crossed the line from curiosity to inconvenience. She understood it too, the moment she saw his hands shake. They are afraid, she said. Yes, he replied. And afraid people don't ask. They take. He considered refusal. He considered compliance. Both tasted like surrender. The city had a way of turning choices into corridors with doors that locked behind you. He looked at the shelves where copied records lay stacked in careful order, land transfers that didn't add up, ordinances amended in the margins without debate, names erased and replaced with numbers. He had believed that making the truth legible would be enough. He was learning that legibility threatened those who depended on confusion. We won't bring the originals, she said, already deciding. We bring what they cannot destroy. And what is that? Witness. They went together. The council chamber smelled of wax and old wood, authority polished until it gleamed. Men and women sat in a semicircle, faces arranged into neutrality. The scholar stood where he was told. She stood where she chose, one pace behind, centered, visible. Murmurs rippled at the sight of her armor. The invitation had not mentioned an orc. We asked for you alone, the chair said. You have me, the scholar replied. And my work. And your escort? She met the chair's gaze. I am here to read. That, more than anything, unsettled them. Papers were placed on the table, carefully selected, carefully incomplete. Questions followed, leading, circular, meant to tire rather than illuminate. The scholar answered with references and citations, speaking softly, steadily. When they pressed him to surrender his notes, he declined with courtesy sharpened into refusal. You are obstructing due process, someone said. She stepped forward then, not threatening, not loud. Cite the statute. A pause. A shuffle. The chair frowned. This is not your place. It is when the law is being used without being named. She replied, and read the relevant clause aloud from memory, voice clear. The words landed in the room like weights, undeniable. Tempers frayed. Politeness thinned. Someone suggested detention for the scholar's own protection. Someone else suggested confiscation. The scholar felt the net tightening, felt the moment tipping toward force. He opened his mouth to protest and felt her presence shift, a subtle rebalancing of the space. No, she said. One word. Final. You will not take him. The chair stared at her. On whose authority? She did not draw steel. She did not raise her voice. She placed a copy of a charter on the table, one she had learned to read, one the city had forgotten it had signed. and tapped the line that bound officials to transparency. "On yours," she said. "You agreed to be seen." The room went very still. Outside, the city hummed, unaware that a hinge had just creaked. Inside, authority faltered not because it was challenged with violence, but because it was confronted with its own language. The council adjourned without resolution. The invitation dissolved into postponement. The threat retreated, wounded and watchful. They walked home under a sky the color of ash. The scholar's legs shook now that the danger had passed. He laughed once, a short, disbelieving sound. "I thought they'd take everything." "They tried," she said. "They failed. For now." She nodded. "That is how this works." He stopped in the street and turned to her. "You didn't have to do that." She met his eyes, steady as stone. "You didn't have to teach me." The city had learned something that day, even if it refused to admit it yet. Knowledge defended itself best when it stood openly, backed not by secrecy, but by someone willing to be seen protecting it. From that moment on, the scholar's work was no longer a private danger. It was a public threat, and the orc warrior who could read had made it clear, without raising a blade, that the cost of silencing it would be far higher than the city had planned to pay. The city did not recover its balance after the council adjourned. It staggered, uncertain whether to tighten its grip or loosen it enough to appear reasonable. Guards lingered where they had never lingered before. Clerks whispered in corners instead of hallways. Notices appeared on walls, revised overnight. Their language softened, but their intent sharpened. Everyone felt the pressure of something unsaid. She felt it as alignment. There were places where standing would mean escalation, and places where standing would mean legitimacy. She chose carefully. Each morning, she accompanied the scholar not in shadow, but in daylight. She walked beside him through markets and archives, through squares where eyes followed and mouths closed. When questioned, she answered politely. When challenged, she asked for clarity. When threatened, she did not react at all. Calm unnerved them more than anger ever had. They attempted compromise next, an offer to fund the scholar's work under supervision. Access restored in exchange for discretion. He listened, weighed the words, and declined. She stood at his shoulder while he did it, armor unpolished, posture neutral, eyes steady. The offer was withdrawn without ceremony. Then came the attempt to separate them. A summons arrived for her. Commendation for service, reassignment to a distant post, promotion wrapped around isolation. She read it aloud in his rooms, voice flat. "They want me elsewhere," she said. "Far enough that I cannot stand beside you." "They're trying to protect me," he said quietly. She snorted. "They are trying to unarm you." She folded the parchment once and set it down. "I refuse." He looked at her sharply. "That could cost you everything." "I already paid the cost," she replied. "This is the return." From that moment, she chose her ground openly. She took a post near the records hall and remained there during its busiest hours. She greeted clerks by name, read posted authorities aloud when confusion was convenient, and corrected guards when their orders exceeded their mandate. She never threatened. She never obstructed lawful work. She simply refused to move when asked without cause. The scholar watched with a mixture of pride and dread. He had believed protection meant interposition, standing in front of harm. She was showing him another way. Occupation. Presence. The slow, public insistence that something mattered enough to be visible. The city responded with frustration. Meetings were called. Warnings were issued. None stuck. Every attempt to push her aside required language they could not afford to say aloud. And every time they tried to act quietly, she made them explain themselves in daylight. "You're forcing them to choose," he said one evening. "Yes," she replied. "Between power and legitimacy. And if they choose power?" She met his gaze. "Then they will show everyone who they are." The first crowd gathered by accident. A delay at the records hall. Raised voices. A guard insisting the building close early. She stepped forward and read the hours posted on the door. A merchant laughed. A clerk nodded. Someone applauded, then fell silent, startled by their own reaction. The guard backed down. Word spread, not of defiance, but of steadiness. Of an orc warrior who protected paper with patience. Of a human scholar who refused to vanish. Of a city being asked, again and again, to justify itself out loud. By the end of the week, people had begun to stand with them without realizing they had chosen sides. A clerk stayed late. A guard asked for clarification instead of issuing an order. A merchant brought copies to be archived instead of hidden. The warrior stood where she had decided to stand, and the ground, once chosen, did not move beneath her feet. The city had expected a clash. What it got was something far more destabilizing. A line drawn in daylight, guarded by someone who could read exactly what was at stake and refused to pretend otherwise. The confrontation arrived without banners or horns, which was how the city preferred its reckoning: quiet enough to deny later, public enough to control. A temporary dais appeared in the square by morning, justified as an informational address. Its wood still pale and smelling of sap. Notices went up in careful language, inviting attendance without explanation. By noon, the square was full. Not a crowd exactly, witnesses. People who wanted to see without being seen choosing. The scholar stood at the edge of the square, notes bound with string, jaw tight. He had not been summoned by name, but everyone knew why the dais existed. She stood beside him, armor clean but unadorned, helm absent, posture neutral. When the officials took their places, the murmurs settled into a hush that felt heavier than shouting. The chair began with reassurance. Transparency, order, stability, words polished until they reflected nothing. Then came the insinuations, misinterpretations of records, irresponsible dissemination, dangerous misunderstandings. The scholar listened, felt the familiar pressure to interrupt, to correct, to defend. She placed 2 fingers lightly against the edge of his sleeve. Not restraint. Reminder. Proceed, she said to the chair, voice carrying. The chair blinked, thrown off by being addressed. This matter concerns civic procedure, he replied. Then speak procedurally, she said. Name the statute you invoke. A ripple moved through the square. The chair named one. She nodded. Read it. A clerk stepped forward, voice thin, and read. The clause limited seizure to evidence of criminal harm. She waited until the final word fell, then asked, where is the harm? The chair gestured vaguely toward the scholar. These documents are copies, she finished, and raised her own sheaf of papers. The originals remain where law requires. These copies cite sources anyone here may check. She turned, slowly, and read a line aloud, steady and clear. Dates, names, transfers, the kind of details that refuse to blur. The scholar felt the square lean in. They tried another tactic. Authority. A guard stepped forward, voice practiced, to request the scholar's cooperation. She did not block him. She did not touch him. She read the posted authority governing the guard's mandate, then asked, calmly, whether the request was voluntary or compulsory. The guard hesitated. The chair cleared his throat. The answer shifted. Voluntary. Then he declines, she said, simply. Frustration sharpened faces. Someone accused her of intimidation. She smiled, brief, without warmth. If reading aloud is intimidation, she said, then the problem is not my presence. A laugh broke from somewhere near the fountain and died quickly, embarrassed but real. The chair tried to regain momentum, to push toward adjournment without resolution. She stepped aside then, not retreating but opening space. Let him speak, she said. The scholar moved to the dais, hands steadier than he felt. He did not argue motive. He presented facts. He read what the city had signed and forgotten. He named the gaps where procedure had swallowed accountability. He spoke softly, precisely, the way truth sounds when it does not need volume. When he finished, silence settled, not the stunned quiet of surprise, but the uncomfortable quiet of recognition. They could have ordered arrests. They could have closed the square. They did neither. Power hesitated when legitimacy wavered, and the city felt it. The chair stood. This will be reviewed, he said, the phrase tasting thin now. She met his eyes. Good, she replied. We will be watching. As the dais emptied, people did not disperse at once. They lingered, talking in low voices, comparing lines they remembered being read. A clerk approached the scholar with a question. A guard asked for a citation. A merchant offered a ledger. Nothing dramatic. Everything changed. On the walk home, the scholar let out a breath he'd been holding for weeks. I didn't think they'd let us finish. They couldn't stop us, she said. Not without showing their hand. And now, she replied. They must choose whether to be seen as they are, or to change. The city had been forced to watch itself in daylight. It did not cheer. It did not riot. It did not resolve. But it remembered. And memory, once awakened and given language, has a way of returning again and again, until it is answered. The city did not erupt after that day. It did something far more unsettling. It adjusted. Notices were rewritten with clearer language. Council sessions were opened an hour longer than usual. A clerk who had once refused access now asked, carefully, whether copies should be logged. These were not victories anyone could point to, not triumphs that could be claimed. They were small shifts, incremental and deniable, and together they frightened the city more than open rebellion ever could have. The scholar returned to his work under a different kind of scrutiny. He was watched, yes, but not hunted. His table in the records hall filled with requests that pretended to be routine. He answered them patiently, precisely, never rushing, never withholding. Truth, he had learned, was best defended by being boringly thorough. When asked why he continued, he answered honestly, because the work mattered, and because stopping would mean agreeing that fear had been right. She remained where she had chosen to stand. That was what shocked the city most. Not the confrontation, not the reading aloud, not even the way authority had faltered under its own language. It was her refusal to escalate. She did not claim leadership. She did not call others to arms. She did not become a symbol she could not control. She simply continued to show up. Each morning, armor plain, posture neutral, eyes alert. She greeted guards by name. She read posted hours when confusion served power. She corrected quietly, publicly, without apology. People expected an orc warrior to defend with violence. Instead, she defended with presence. When a merchant tried to pressure a clerk into altering a record, she stood beside the clerk and asked for the clause that permitted it. When a guard threatened removal, she requested the authority in writing and waited. When a counselor attempted to spin the events of the square into rumor, she read the transcript aloud in a market stall, voice steady, hands empty. Nothing about it looked like war. Everything about it made harm expensive. The scholar watched, humbled. He had believed protection meant shielding knowledge from view. She had taught him the opposite. That knowledge survived best when it was made ordinary, when it was read aloud, shared, checked, returned. When it was guarded not by secrecy, but by someone willing to stand where everyone could see them doing it. One evening, as the lamps were lit and the city settled into its careful routines, he asked her the question he had never dared to voice. If they try again, if they come with force, will you fight? She considered it, then shook her head. If they come with force, they will lose legitimacy. If they lose legitimacy, they lose faster than steel ever could make them. And if they don't, then they will change, she said. Or pretend to. He smiled faintly. Is that enough? It is for now. The city's shock did not come from defeat or bloodshed. It came from the realization that an orc warrior had learned to read, and, in doing so, had learned to choose. She chose where to stand. She chose what to protect. She chose restraint over spectacle, patience over fear. And by choosing openly, she forced everyone else to confront their own choices as well. On a quiet morning weeks later, a new notice appeared on the board at the garrison. Clear language. Named authority. Defined limits. She stood before it, read it once, then stepped aside so others could read too. No one laughed. No one jeered. A guard asked a question. A clerk answered it. The scholar passed by with a bundle of copies under his arm. Their eyes met. No words were needed. The city had not been overthrown. It had been read. And in being read, out loud, in daylight, it had been changed by the one thing it had never prepared to defend against. An orc warrior who knew exactly what the words meant, and refused to let them be used in the dark.